The grand courtroom of Brooklyn's Superior Court buzzed with anticipation. Rows of polished wooden benches were filled with journalists, spectators, and legal professionals. At the heart of the commotion sat Karen Whitmore, an impeccably dressed woman in her early 50s. She exuded confidence, her blonde hair neatly styled, her pearl earrings gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She had been wronged, and she was here to make sure justice was served on her terms. The defendant, a quiet, seemingly clueless older black man, sat at the opposite table. Dressed in an old, worn-out brown suit, he looked completely out of place. His hands were folded neatly on the desk, his expression neutral, almost detached. Karen smirked. "This is going to be easy." She glanced at her lawyer, Roger Hartman, a sleek, sharp-tongued attorney who had won numerous high-profile civil cases. His suit cost more than most people made in a month, and his polished demeanor made him the perfect choice for crushing an insignificant nobody like the man sitting across from them. Karen had sued him for defamation. A month ago, during an argument at an upscale restaurant, the man had called her entitled, ignorant, and uninformed. In public, no less. People had laughed at her, and she had been humiliated. The worst part? She had no idea who he even was. And yet, here they were. A Karen versus a nobody. A guaranteed win. A firm gavel crack silenced the room. Judge Carla Simmons, a stern but fair woman, took her seat at the bench, her sharp eyes sweeping across the room. Case number 1427, Whitmore versus Wallace. The plaintiff, Mrs. Karen Whitmore, is suing the defendant, Mr. Leonard Wallace, for defamation. Karen leaned back in her chair, satisfied. Judge Simmons continued. "Plaintiff, you may proceed." Roger Hartman stood smoothly, buttoning his expensive suit. "Thank you, Your Honor." He turned toward the jury with a practiced expression of concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we address a grave injustice. My client, Mrs. Whitmore, was publicly humiliated and slandered by a man who had no right, no basis whatsoever, to insult her character. His words were hateful, demeaning, and damaging. He walked across the courtroom, his voice measured and confident. You will hear today how my client was simply enjoying a meal when she was confronted, insulted, and laughed at by strangers. And all because of one man's reckless words." He turned toward Leonard Wallace, his lips curling slightly. "A man," he added, "who has no background in law, no relevant education, and no public reputation. A nobody who decided, in his arrogance, that he had the right to ruin my client's reputation." Karen nodded along, enjoying every second of this. Hartman continued. "For this, we seek $250,000 in damages for emotional distress and reputational harm." He gestured toward Karen dramatically. "A woman's good name is priceless, but today we ask the court to assign a value to the damage done." Judge Simmons nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Hartman. Defense, your opening statement?" The courtroom shifted its attention to the old man in the brown suit. Leonard Wallace slowly stood. He was tall, but his posture was slightly slouched, giving the impression of someone meek and forgettable. He adjusted his thick glasses, cleared his throat, and took a deep breath. Then, in a soft, almost apologetic voice, he said, "Well, I don't really know what to say, Your Honor. I just called her a Karen because she was being one." A snicker rippled through the courtroom. Karen's face turned red. Judge Simmons shot a sharp glare toward the audience. "Order in the court." Leonard continued, scratching the back of his head. "I mean, everyone saw what happened. I wasn't lying. And, I don't really think she can sue me for telling the truth, right?" Hartman sighed loudly, shaking his head in mock disappointment. Karen, however, was fuming. This man was acting like an idiot. She shot a glare toward the jury, ensuring that they recognized how ridiculous he sounded. Judge Simmons raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Wallace, do you have legal representation?" Leonard scratched his chin, as if thinking for the first time. "No, Your Honor," he admitted. "I figured I'd just, handle this myself." Karen grinned. "Oh, this was too easy." Roger Hartman stood again. "Your Honor, we'd like to call our first witness to the stand, Mrs. Karen Whitmore." Karen glided toward the stand, every step rehearsed. She was the victim, and she needed the jury to believe it. Once sworn in, Hartman smiled at her. Mrs. Whitmore, could you describe what happened on the night in question? Karen sighed dramatically, placing a delicate hand on her chest. It was a horrible experience, she said. I was enjoying dinner with my friends, and everything was lovely, until he decided to ruin my evening. She gestured toward Leonard, who simply blinked at her like he had no idea what she was talking about. Karen continued, I had merely asked to speak to a manager about an issue with my meal, and suddenly, he was yelling at me. He called me a Karen, told everyone I was entitled, and humiliated me in front of the entire restaurant. Hartman nodded gravely, glancing at the jury. And how did that make you feel, Mrs. Whitmore? Karen exhaled dramatically. I was devastated. People laughed at me. My friends were embarrassed. I had to leave the restaurant in tears. She turned toward the jury, her expression sorrowful. No woman should have to endure that kind of humiliation. Hartman gave her a sympathetic look. Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. No further questions. Karen shot a smug glance at Leonard as she left the stand. Now, he had to explain himself. And what could he possibly say? Judge Simmons turned to the defense. Mr. Wallace, you may cross-examine. Leonard stood slowly, stretching slightly, then shuffled toward the stand. Karen watched him, waiting for him to embarrass himself. Leonard adjusted his glasses and tilted his head. So, just to be clear, he said, his voice mild and friendly. You were upset because I called you a Karen, right? Karen scoffed. Obviously. Leonard nodded thoughtfully. And you said you were humiliated because people laughed? Karen rolled her eyes. Yes, that's what I just said. Leonard smiled slightly, then turned toward the jury. Huh. He nodded. You know, I could have sworn that public figures deal with that kind of thing all the time. Karen froze. Hartman sat up straighter. Judge Simmons frowned. Where are you going with this, Mr. Wallace? Leonard pushed his glasses up. Oh, nowhere, Your Honor. He gave an innocent shrug. I just think it's funny how she's suing me for something that Supreme Court justices deal with every day. The courtroom fell silent. Karen blinked. What did he just say? Leonard smiled politely. Your Honor, I'd like to submit my credentials to the court. He pulled out a document and placed it on the judge's desk. Judge Simmons picked it up, scanned it, then froze. Karen felt her stomach drop. Something was very, very wrong. Because Leonard Wallace wasn't a nobody. He was the secret legal advisor to the Supreme Court, and Karen Whitmore had just sued him over a restaurant argument. A wave of confusion swept through the courtroom. Karen's smug confidence evaporated as she watched Judge Simmons' expression shift. The judge adjusted her glasses, reading the document Leonard Wallace had just handed her. Then, with an almost bemused disbelief, she turned toward him. Mr. Wallace, is this document legitimate? Leonard Wallace nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Simmons exhaled slowly, then set the paper down and looked at Karen. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, her tone neutral but firm, did you do any research on the man you're suing before filing this lawsuit? Karen felt her throat go dry. What do you mean? Judge Simmons tapped the document on her desk. Because, according to this, Mr. Wallace is one of the leading legal advisors for the United States Supreme Court. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Karen's heart slammed against her chest. She turned to her lawyer, Roger Hartman, who looked just as stunned as she was. Hartman leaned toward her, whispering sharply, Did you know this? Karen shook her head furiously. No, I thought he was just some nobody, a random old man. Hartman rubbed his temples. Oh, for the love of... Judge Simmons continued, addressing the jury. For those unfamiliar with legal advisory roles, let me clarify. Mr. Wallace isn't just any lawyer. He has spent the last 20 years drafting opinions and advising on some of the most important Supreme Court cases in the country. Karen's face turned red hot. This wasn't happening. This man, this nobody she had sued, was one of the most powerful legal minds in the country. Judge Simmons turned to Leonard. Mr. Wallace, I must ask, why are you not represented by legal counsel? Leonard gave a small, sheepish smile. Well, Your Honor, to be honest, I thought this whole case was kind of funny. A snort of laughter came from somewhere in the back of the courtroom. Karen's fingers curled into fists. This wasn't funny. This was a nightmare. Hartman quickly stood up, trying to regain control of the situation. Your Honor, regardless of Mr. Wallace's credentials, the facts remain the same. He humiliated my client in a public setting, and as a result, her reputation has suffered. Karen nodded vigorously, clinging to any hope that she could still win this case. Yes, that's right. It doesn't matter if he's whatever he is. He still slandered me. Leonard sighed dramatically. Defamation, Mrs. Whitmore. Slander refers to spoken statements. I said nothing in public, so technically, this would be a case of libel, if anything. Karen blinked. Hartman clenched his jaw. Karen whispered, "What's the difference?" Hartman hissed under his breath, "Shut up." Leonard smiled innocently. It's important to be accurate when dealing with legal matters. Karen felt her blood boil. She pointed a finger at him. You tricked me." Leonard tilted his head. "Oh, and how did I do that?" Karen opened her mouth, then realized she had no answer. Judge Simmons cleared her throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, let's keep the theatrics to a minimum." Karen forced herself to breathe, trying to compose herself. Her lawyer quickly redirected the argument. "Your Honor," Hartman said, "what matters here is intent. Regardless of Mr. Wallace's legal background, he deliberately ridiculed my client in public. He caused emotional and reputational damage. The law must still apply." Karen nodded, her confidence returning. "Yes, that's right. He was still guilty." Judge Simmons turned to Leonard. "Mr. Wallace, how do you respond?" Leonard let out a deep sigh, then leaned forward slightly. "Well, Your Honor, I guess the real question here is, what reputation is she claiming I ruined?" The courtroom fell silent. Karen stiffened. Hartman quickly spoke up. "Mrs. Whitmore is a highly regarded member of her community." Leonard raised an eyebrow. "Oh, in what capacity?" Hartman hesitated. "She is an active socialite, and—" Leonard held up a hand. "Oh, I see. She means social media reputation." Karen's stomach sank. Leonard turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit A." He pulled out a stack of papers and walked toward the judge's bench. Judge Simmons frowned as she flipped through the pages. Leonard smiled. "That's a collection of social media posts, online comments, and video clips of Mrs. Whitmore." Karen's mouth went dry. Judge Simmons read aloud. "This Karen needs to be stopped. Another privileged woman throwing a tantrum. She's the reason people hate the name Karen now." Karen squeaked. That's just trolls on the internet." Leonard chuckled. "Ah, I see. So, random people on the internet calling you names doesn't count as reputational damage." Karen froze. Hartman quickly stood. "Objection. This is irrelevant." Judge Simmons held up a hand. "Actually, it's very relevant." She turned toward Karen. "Mrs. Whitmore, can you prove that your reputation has been damaged in any way that is measurable and directly linked to Mr. Wallace?" Karen stammered. I mean, people were laughing at me." Leonard adjusted his glasses. "Yes, and would you like to know why?" Karen stayed silent. Leonard turned toward the jury. "People laughed, not because I called her a Karen, but because she acted like one." Another snicker spread through the room. Karen's face burned red. Judge Simmons sighed, rubbing her temple. "Mrs. Whitmore, do you have any hard evidence of financial or social harm?" Karen opened her mouth, and then shut it. The jury watched her struggle for words. Finally, Judge Simmons leaned forward, fingers interlocked. "Mrs. Whitmore, let me remind you, defamation law does not exist to protect feelings. It exists to protect real, measurable damage to reputation or finances." Karen swallowed hard. The realization hit her like a freight train. She was losing. Leonard straightened his tie. "Your Honor, I move for immediate dismissal on the grounds of lack of evidence and frivolous litigation." Karen jumped up. "No, he has to be punished." Judge Simmons sighed. "Mrs. Whitmore, sit down." Karen refused. "This isn't fair. I deserve justice." Leonard gave a small shrug. "Well, in a way, you're getting justice, Mrs. Whitmore." Karen glared. "What are you talking about?" Leonard smiled pleasantly. "You want a legal lesson?" He gestured around. "Here you go." The courtroom erupted in laughter. Judge Simmons let out a deep breath. I'll issue my ruling after a brief recess. She slammed the gavel. Karen collapsed into her chair, shaking with rage. Hartman turned toward her, whispering furiously, "You sued a Supreme Court legal advisor over a restaurant insult." Karen stared straight ahead, realizing her mistake too late. Leonard? He just leaned back, enjoying the show. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as the judge called for a brief recess. The jury members exchanged glances, their earlier sympathy for Karen Whitmore now replaced with skepticism. Karen sat stiffly in her chair, her knuckles white from gripping the edge of the table. Across from her, Leonard Wallace, the man she had mocked, dismissed, and sued, sat with the calm patience of someone who had already won. Her lawyer, Roger Hartman, furiously whispered to her. "Karen, what were you thinking?" he hissed. "You dragged a Supreme Court legal advisor into court over a dinner argument? Do you realize how bad this looks?" Karen's nostrils flared. "I don't care who he is. He embarrassed me in public. He called me a Karen." Hartman exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Karen, do you understand that in legal terms, you have no case? You're arguing hurt feelings, not actual defamation." Karen crossed her arms, huffing indignantly. "He ruined my night. That should count for something." Hartman looked like he wanted to slam his head against the table. Meanwhile, Leonard casually sipped a glass of water, completely unbothered. After a few moments, Judge Carla Simmons re-entered the courtroom, and the chatter immediately died down. She took her seat, adjusting her robe before turning to Leonard. "Mr. Wallace, before I issue my ruling, is there anything else you'd like to add?" Leonard nodded, standing slowly. He adjusted his worn-out brown suit and turned to the jury. "Your Honor, I think this case presents an excellent teaching opportunity." Karen's eye twitched. Judge Simmons sighed, but a small smirk tugged at her lips. "Go on." Leonard clasped his hands together. "Since the plaintiff, Mrs. Whitmore, has clearly never studied defamation law, I'd be happy to provide a brief lesson for her, and for the jury as well." Karen gritted her teeth. She didn't need a lesson. She needed revenge. Leonard paced slowly, addressing the jury in an almost professor-like tone. "Now, let's break this down into something simple," he said. "Mrs. Whitmore is claiming I defamed her, correct?" He turned toward Karen. "That means, legally, she has to prove 3 things." Karen folded her arms, fuming. Leonard raised one finger. "First, she must prove that my statement was false." He smiled. "Now, I called her Karen. That term, as we all know, is widely used to describe someone entitled, demanding, and overreacting to minor inconveniences." Karen's face turned red. Leonard gave a small shrug. "And considering the fact that she sued me over a restaurant disagreement, I'd say that's more of a personal observation than a false statement." A few jurors stifled laughter. Karen glared at them. Leonard raised a second finger. "Second, she must prove that my statement caused actual, measurable harm to her reputation." He paused dramatically, then turned to Karen. "Tell me, Mrs. Whitmore, did you lose your job because of my comment?" Karen hesitated. "Well, no, but..." Leonard continued. "Did you lose friends? Family? Was your social standing destroyed?" Karen faltered. "People laughed at me." Leonard raised an eyebrow. "Ah, yes, because laughter is, as we all know, a measurable legal damage." The jury chuckled again. Karen looked like she was going to explode. Judge Simmons knocked her gavel lightly. "Order." Leonard lifted a third finger. "Finally, Mrs. Whitmore must prove that I acted with actual malice, that I intentionally tried to ruin her life." He smiled warmly. "And I hate to break it to you, Mrs. Whitmore, but I didn't think about you for more than 10 seconds that night." The courtroom erupted into laughter. Karen's face burned hot. Roger Hartman slumped in his chair, knowing the case was beyond saving. Hartman stood, desperate to salvage what little was left. "Your Honor, with all due respect, just because Mr. Wallace has legal knowledge does not mean he can avoid accountability. He still publicly humiliated my client." Judge Simmons leaned forward. "Mr. Hartman, you are an experienced attorney. Do you truly believe this case is legally sound?" Hartman paused. He knew the answer, but Karen stared at him, demanding loyalty. Finally, with a long sigh, he muttered, My client believes she has suffered harm. Leonard grinned. Ah, he said. I see. The delusional defense. Karen jumped out her seat. How dare you? Judge Simmons slammed her gavel. Mrs. Whitmore, sit down. Karen pointed at Leonard. You are the worst person I have ever met. Leonard tilted his head. Really? Over a dinner argument? Karen clenched her fists. This isn't over. Leonard checked his non-existent watch. Actually, I think it is. Judge Simmons rubbed her temple, clearly exhausted. Mr. Wallace, she said, do you have a countermotion? Leonard nodded. Yes, Your Honor. His expression shifted, becoming slightly more serious. This case is a frivolous lawsuit. It wastes this court's time, the jury's time, and taxpayer money. I move not only for immediate dismissal, but for the court to consider sanctions against the plaintiff for filing a baseless defamation suit. Karen's jaw dropped. Hartman whipped his head toward Leonard. Wait, what? Judge Simmons nodded slowly. I was just about to suggest that myself. Karen sputtered. Sanctions? For what? Leonard smiled. For being a Karen. The jury burst into laughter. Judge Simmons sighed, knocking her gavel twice. Order in the court. She turned toward Karen. Mrs. Whitmore, in light of zero legal evidence to support your claim, and in light of your emotional, rather than legal arguments, I find that this case is frivolous. Karen froze. This court officially dismisses all charges with prejudice. Furthermore, I am imposing a fine of $10,000 for wasting this court's time. Karen's eyes bulged. $10,000 for what? Judge Simmons stared her down. For failing to understand basic defamation law. Consider it an educational fee. Karen screeched in rage. Leonard grinned. See? That's the sound you made when I called you a Karen. Judge Simmons smirked. Case dismissed. Gavel slam. The courtroom erupted in whispers and laughter as Karen stormed out, her face red, her reputation in ruins. Roger Hartman trailed behind her, already thinking about quitting as her lawyer. Leonard? He simply walked toward the exit, hands in his pockets, smiling. As he passed a young lawyer in the crowd, the man leaned in and whispered, Damn, Mr. Wallace, remind me never to argue against you. Leonard chuckled. I'd advise against it. And with that, the Supreme Court's secret legal advisor walked off into the sunset, leaving one angry Karen to scream at the sky. Karen Whitmore stormed out of the courtroom, her designer heels clacking furiously against the marble floor. The whispers and muffled laughter of the courtroom followed her like an unwanted shadow. Her hands trembled with rage, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. $10,000? She hissed under her breath. I have to pay $10,000 for losing. Her lawyer, Roger Hartman, struggled to keep up with her furious pace. He reached out, gripping her arm lightly. Karen, calm down, he whispered. Karen yanked her arm free, whirling around. Calm down, she screeched. A passing court clerk flinched, picking up their pace. Karen jabbed a finger at Hartman's expensive lapel, her voice venomous. You let this happen. You were supposed to win. You were supposed to make him pay. Hartman exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. Karen, this case was doomed from the start. You sued a Supreme Court legal advisor over a restaurant insult. What did you think was going to happen? Karen crossed her arms, shaking her head. I don't care who he is. That nobody embarrassed me. And now, because of you, I look like an idiot. Hartman blinked slowly, as if processing an unbearable level of stupidity. You don't look like an idiot, Karen, he said. You are one. Karen froze. Excuse me. Hartman let out a deep breath, the kind that suggested he had held this in for years. You dragged me into this circus, wasted my time, embarrassed yourself on a national scale, and now you're blaming me? He chuckled darkly. No, Karen, you did this to yourself. Karen's eyes widened. Are you firing me? Hartman laughed. Oh, absolutely. Consider this my official resignation. He took out a business card, scribbled something on it, and handed it to her. Karen snatched it, scanning the writing. It said, Find a therapist. Karen let out an ear-piercing shriek. Hartman, without looking back, walked away, hands in his pockets. And just like that, Karen Whitmore was lawyerless, broke, and the laughingstock of the courthouse. But she wasn't done just yet. As soon as Karen stomped toward the courthouse exit, she was hit with blinding camera flashes. Mrs. Whitmore, any comments on the ruling? Karen, do you regret suing Leonard Wallace? Is it true you didn't know he was a Supreme Court advisor? Karen shoved past the reporters, her rage boiling over. And no comment, she snapped. I will not be harassed by the fake news media. A young journalist, probably in her mid-20s, tilted her head. Fake news? She asked. But didn't you lose in a court of law? Karen glared at her. You little. But before she could scream herself into another lawsuit, the journalist spoke again. Do you think suing someone for calling you a Karen is kind of Karen behavior? A wave of laughter erupted from the reporters. Karen turned beet red. You people are, she sputtered, pointing at the cameras. You're all against me. One of the reporters, a grinning young man, leaned into his microphone. Mrs. Whitmore, do you think you're being, what's the word, defamed right now? Karen froze. For a moment, there was complete silence. And then, arf, Karen threw her designer handbag at the pavement and stormed off, nearly tripping over her own heels as the press howled with laughter. The cameras flashed nonstop, capturing the greatest Karen meltdown of all time. And just like that, her public humiliation was immortalized forever. Leonard Wallace watched all of this unfold from across the street, sipping his black coffee with pure amusement. Next to him, his assistant, John, chuckled. You know, sir, John said, I haven't seen someone lose that spectacularly since the last Senate hearings. Leonard nodded thoughtfully. It really is impressive. She managed to lose in court and in the court of public opinion simultaneously. John smirked. A rare talent. Leonard chuckled. Indeed. He took another sip of coffee. Think she'll appeal the case? John asked. Leonard raised an eyebrow. With what lawyer? John laughed loudly. Fair point. Leonard patted John's shoulder. Come on, let's go before she tries to sue the press next. As they walked away, Leonard took one final glance at the courthouse, where Karen was still shouting at reporters. He shook his head, smiling. Some people never learned. By the time Karen got home, her name was trending. Hashtag Karen lawsuit fails. Hashtag janitor beats Karen. Hashtag Karen versus Supreme Court advisor. Memes, GIFs, and video clips of her courtroom humiliation flooded Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook. One clip went particularly viral, the moment Leonard Wallace effortlessly dismantled her entire lawsuit. The top comment read, This man didn't just win the case. He gave her a free law school lesson. Another read, Karen tried to sue a Supreme Court advisor and actually thought she'd win. Peak comedy. Karen threw her phone across the room, screaming. She was a joke, and there was nothing she could do about it. Meanwhile, Leonard Wallace returned to his normal life, completely unfazed by the chaos he had left behind. The press kept reaching out to him for interviews, but he declined them all. He had nothing more to prove. He had walked into court, destroyed a Karen, and taught a masterclass on defamation law, all without breaking a sweat. The world would remember him as the Supreme Court's secret weapon. And Karen Whitmore? She would forever be known as the woman who sued a Supreme Court legal advisor over dinner and lost. Justice had never tasted so sweet. 1 week later, at a different restaurant, a woman nearly snapped at a waiter for getting her order wrong. But before she could unleash her inner Karen, her friend grabbed her arm. Careful, her friend whispered. The woman frowned. What? Her friend slowly pulled up a news article on her phone. The headline read, Karen sues Supreme Court advisor over dinner insult and gets wrecked in court. The woman stared at the article. She looked at the waiter. She looked back at the article. Then, she slowly lowered her voice. You know what? She said. It's fine. No worries. She even forced a smile, because she had learned something very important. Sometimes it's better to just let things go. Karen Whitmore sat in her dimly lit living room, scrolling through hundreds of memes, tweets, and news articles mocking her spectacular courtroom loss. Every headline, every joke, every video clip was like a fresh slap to the face. Karen sues a Supreme Court advisor and regrets it immediately. A legal beatdown so bad, even lawyers are studying it. She wanted justice. She got a free law lecture instead. Karen gritted her teeth. This was unacceptable. She had spent years building her reputation. She was respected. She was influential. She was a somebody. And now, because of one man, she had become a national punchline. She threw her phone onto the couch and stood up, trembling with rage. "I'm not going to let this slide," she muttered. Karen Whitmore wasn't just going to accept defeat. She was going to get even. The next morning, Karen stormed into the office of her new lawyer, a young, overly ambitious attorney named Travis Gilman. Travis was fresh out of law school and desperate for big cases to make a name for himself. And Karen needed someone desperate. She slammed a stack of papers onto his desk. "I want to appeal." Travis blinked, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Appeal what exactly?" Karen leaned in. "The ruling. I want that decision overturned. I want Leonard Wallace in court again." Travis hesitated, flipping through the court transcripts. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm looking at this case, and it's not very strong." Karen's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Travis cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Well, you sued a Supreme Court legal advisor over an insult. The judge ruled that your case was frivolous. That's pretty final." Karen slammed her hands on the desk. "I don't care." Travis jumped. Karen inhaled sharply, forcing herself to calm down. "Look, Travis," she said, her voice dripping with forced patience. "This is about principle. I refuse to let this man get away with humiliating me. I need a new strategy." Travis bit his lip, thinking, well, we could try suing for emotional distress instead. Karen's eyes lit up. Yes, emotional distress. Travis hesitated, but it's a long shot. Judges really don't like cases that. "I'll double your retainer," Karen interrupted. Travis perked up immediately. "I'll get started on the paperwork." Karen smirked. Leonard Wallace had humiliated her in court once, but this time she would be ready. Across town, Leonard Wallace sat in his favorite cafe, sipping his usual black coffee, enjoying his morning routine. His assistant, John, slid into the seat across from him, smirking. "You're not going to believe this," John said. Leonard raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold statement." "Try me." John pulled out his phone and flipped the screen toward Leonard. It was an article from a legal blog. The headline read, "Karen Whitmore to appeal defamation case against Supreme Court advisor Leonard Wallace." Leonard blinked. Then he set down his coffee. "She's actually trying again?" John chuckled. "Oh, not just trying. She's doubling down. Hired some fresh out of law school kid to push an emotional distress claim." Leonard sighed, rubbing his temple. "She's truly committed to being wrong at the highest level, isn't she?" John grinned. "So, what do you want to do?" Leonard picked up his coffee again, taking a slow sip. "Absolutely nothing." John raised an eyebrow. "Nothing?" Leonard smirked. "This woman has no case. She had no case before, and she has no case now. If she wants to pay another lawyer to lose for her, that's her business." John shook his head, laughing. "You know, most people would be mad about this." Leonard shrugged. "I'm not most people." And with that, he flipped open his newspaper and continued reading, as if Karen Whitmore's latest tantrum was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. 2 weeks later, Karen Whitmore found herself back in the same courtroom, standing before the same Judge Simmons. The judge stared at her, unimpressed. "Mrs. Whitmore." Again, Karen lifted her chin defiantly. "I refuse to let this injustice stand." Judge Simmons sighed deeply, rubbing her temples. "Very well. Proceed." Karen's new lawyer, Travis Gilman, nervously adjusted his tie before beginning his argument. "Your Honor, my client has suffered severe emotional distress due to Mr. Wallace's actions. The public humiliation, the media attention, it has negatively affected her well-being, her relationships, and her ability to live a normal life." Judge Simmons turned to Leonard. "Mr. Wallace, how do you respond?" Leonard slowly stood, straightening his suit. "Your Honor, I have only one question for the plaintiff." He turned toward Karen, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "who told you to file this lawsuit?" Karen's face scrunched up in confusion. "What?" Leonard tilted his head. "Who told you," he repeated, "that this lawsuit would actually work?" Karen hesitated. Travis fidgeted. The courtroom sat in complete silence. Finally, Karen blurted, I thought of it myself. Leonard nodded. Ah, so you advised yourself on this legal action? Karen blinked. Well, yes. Leonard turned toward the judge. Your Honor, I move for immediate dismissal on the grounds that the plaintiff, who has no legal training whatsoever, is making another baseless claim out of pure spite. Judge Simmons sighed. Motion granted. Case dismissed. Gavel slam. Karen's face drained of color. What? Judge Simmons stared at her flatly. Mrs. Whitmore, at this point, you are dangerously close to being held in contempt of court. Karen sputtered. But, Leonard adjusted his glasses, turning toward her. You don't need a lawsuit, Mrs. Whitmore, he said smoothly. You need a hobby. The jury laughed. Karen let out an ear-splitting shriek. Leonard? He simply walked out of the courtroom, victorious once again. Over the next few months, Karen tried, filing another lawsuit. It was dismissed immediately, going on a talk show to tell her side of the story. She was mocked by the audience, starting an anti-defamation campaign. It was hijacked by people making fun of her. No matter what she did, the internet never forgot. Karen Whitmore's name was permanently tied to one of the worst lawsuits in modern history. And Leonard Wallace? He never had to lift a finger again, because justice had already been served. Karen Whitmore sat at her kitchen table, staring at the final notice from the court. Case dismissed. Again, sanction appelled. Legal fees owed, $10,000. Her bank account had already taken a hit from the first case. Now, she was deeper in the hole. She had tried everything, filing new lawsuits, hiring a PR firm, even going on daytime TV to claim she was a victim of legal injustice. It had all backfired spectacularly. The clips of Leonard Wallace destroying her in court had spread like wildfire. Karen tries to sue a Supreme Court advisor and regrets it instantly. Legal genius turns a Karen lawsuit into a masterclass on defamation law. The most satisfying courtroom takedown of the year. Her neighbors avoided her. Her bridge club kicked her out. Even the grocery store cashier gave her a look of pity. Karen's fingers curled into fists. This was unacceptable. She wasn't just going to sit there and let Leonard Wallace walk away victorious. She still had one last move left. If the courts wouldn't listen to her, then she would go straight to the people. A week later, outside the Brooklyn Superior Courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Karen had spent the last few days handing out flyers, posting on social media, and begging anyone who would listen to join her cause. She stood at the front, holding a homemade sign that read, Justice for Karen. Behind her, about 7 people had shown up. 2 of them were elderly women from her neighborhood who had no idea what was going on. One was a random conspiracy theorist with a sign about lizard people controlling the courts. The others? Mostly curious bystanders who wanted to see the train wreck unfold. Karen cleared her throat, stepping up onto a small folding chair to address her audience. My fellow citizens, she shouted. Some people in the crowd stifled laughter. We are here today because our justice system is broken, because the courts have been corrupted, because I was mocked, humiliated, and financially ruined for standing up for my dignity. One of the elderly women clapped weakly. The conspiracy theorist nodded knowingly. Karen felt emboldened. They call me a Karen, she continued. They laughed at me, but I say, and no more. We will not be silenced. Just then, a black sedan pulled up in front of the courthouse. The crowd turned their heads. Leonard Wallace stepped out, adjusting his brown suit and glasses, holding a coffee in one hand and a newspaper in the other. The second he saw the protest, he let out a deep sigh. Karen's eyes lit up with fury. There he is, she shrieked, pointing at Leonard. The small crowd turned to watch. Leonard glanced at them, then at Karen's homemade sign. He squinted at it for a second. Then, he did something that completely shattered Karen's already fragile ego. He laughed, a deep, amused, completely unbothered chuckle. Karen turned red. Stop laughing at me, she screeched. Leonard shook his head, sipping his coffee. Karen, he said smoothly, if I had known you were going to do all this, I would have charged you for the legal lesson. A few people in the crowd snickered. Karen's rage exploded. "This isn't funny," she yelled. "You ruined my life." Leonard raised an eyebrow. "Did I?" He pulled out his phone, scrolled for a moment, then turned the screen toward Karen. It was her own social media posts. Rant about how she deserved justice, how Leonard had to be punished, how she was fighting for all women. Leonard tapped the screen. "You did all of this to yourself," he said simply. "You lost in court because you were wrong. You lost in the media because you doubled down. And now, you're standing in the street, yelling at a man who has already moved on." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The few remaining protesters shifted uncomfortably. Leonard sighed again, rubbing his temple. "Karen, let me ask you something." She crossed her arms, glaring. "What?" Leonard smiled slightly. "Do you ever get tired of being like this?" Karen froze. For the first time, she had no comeback. Leonard let out a breath and checked his watch. "Well, I'd love to stay and chat, but I have actual work to do. So if you'll excuse me." He walked past her and into the courthouse, completely ignoring the protest. Karen stood there, shaking with fury, as the few remaining supporters started slipping away. One of the elderly women patted her on the arm. "Maybe it's time to let it go, dear." Karen stared at her. The woman smiled sympathetically, then turned and walked off. One by one, the rest of the small crowd dispersed. Karen was alone. Over the next few weeks, Karen tried one last time to stay relevant. She attempted, writing an op-ed about being silenced. No one published it. Starting a Karen awareness group. It had 3 members before imploding in drama. Trying to sue the media, lawyers refused to take her case. Nothing worked. She had lost. For good. One day, she finally logged onto social media, ready to post another angry rant, only to find that she had become a meme again. A new trend had started. Whenever someone overreacted in public, people would comment, "Careful, you don't want to pull a Karen Whitmore." Her name had become a warning. She let out a weak, defeated scream, then deleted her accounts. And just like that, Karen Whitmore finally disappeared from public view. Meanwhile, Leonard Wallace never thought about her again. He went back to his quiet life of advising the Supreme Court, drinking black coffee, and making rookie lawyers nervous. One afternoon, John, his assistant, asked him, "Hey, sir, whatever happened to that Karen?" Leonard barely looked up from his newspaper. "Who?" John laughed. "Exactly." Leonard just sipped his coffee. Some people never learned. And some people, they were simply too insignificant to remember. For the first time in months, Karen Whitmore sat alone in her silent house. No cameras, no reporters, no more courtrooms, no more lawsuits. She had spent every waking moment trying to destroy Leonard Wallace. She had filed lawsuits. She had staged protests. She had fought against reality itself. And in the end, she had lost everything. Her money, gone. Her reputation, destroyed. Her social circle, vanished. Even her lawyers wouldn't take her calls anymore. The name Karen Whitmore was now a cautionary tale. She was no longer a victim. She was a punchline. A single letter sat on the kitchen table. It was from the court. Karen hesitated, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Her eyes skimmed the contents, and she felt her stomach drop. It was official. The court had permanently dismissed all her cases. And worse, they had barred her from filing any further defamation lawsuits without court approval. She was now legally recognized as a frivolous litigant, a person who abuses the court system for personal revenge. Karen squeezed the paper so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her last weapon, her ability to sue people over nothing, was now gone. The realization hit her like a truck. She had no more moves left. She had fought the law, and the law had won. Meanwhile, across town, Leonard Wallace sat in his favorite cafe, flipping through the newspaper with his usual calm indifference. His assistant, John, slid into the seat across from him, grinning. "Sir, you're going to love this," John said, setting his phone down on the table. Leonard took a slow sip of his black coffee, raising an eyebrow. John turned the phone toward him, showing a headline from a legal blog. Karen Whitmore officially barred from filing frivolous lawsuits. Leonard's lips curled into a small smirk. "Ah," he mused. "Took them long enough." John chuckled. "She really thought she could beat you, huh?" Leonard set down his coffee and adjusted his glasses, his voice completely unbothered. Some people, he said, confuse loudness with power. John nodded. And some people don't know when to quit. Leonard flipped to the next page of his newspaper. Exactly. John grinned. I guess we've seen the last of her, huh? Leonard took another slow sip of coffee, looking out the window at the city. Without even looking at John, he said, Who? John burst out laughing. Leonard? He just kept reading his newspaper, as if Karen Whitmore had never even existed. Because, as far as he was concerned, she hadn't. Somewhere in a completely different city, a woman stood in line at a coffee shop, growing increasingly frustrated. The barista had messed up her order. She felt the familiar surge of entitlement, the urge to raise her voice, demand a manager, make a scene. But just as she opened her mouth, her friend nudged her. Hey, her friend whispered. Remember Karen Whitmore? The woman's face paled. She closed her mouth, and instead of screaming, she forced a tight smile and said, It's fine. No worries. The barista smiled in relief. Thank you so much. The woman's friend grinned. See, she whispered, you don't want to be a Karen. The woman exhaled slowly, nodding. Because some people learn their lesson the hard way. And some people, they were smart enough to learn from the failures of others.